welcome back again. For those of you guys who've tuned into our podcast in the past, for those of you who are new, welcome. And hopefully you'll find this information engaging and enticing. And we'll hopefully see you guys back on future podcasts. My name is Hamlet Yousef. I'm with the Irregular Warfare Initiative, specifically their Economic Lawfare and Warfare Group. Here with Matt, Gianni, and Tom, who participated in prior podcasts as well. I want to go ahead and do a quick round the room and do brief introductions for those of you who are new before we jump into the meat of the matter. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss here in terms of what's happening between Iran and the U.S. We'll have a couple questions to get into, and then hopefully I'll leave you guys with a better perspective of I think what's playing out here. So by background, I run a VC fund that invests at the intersection of technology and national security, prior government service, but also more importantly, I guess as important as ethnically Iranian. So that kind of jades or gives some bias to my perspective on Iran and kind of my hawkish stance, which I will try to best to filter as I can throughout this. But let's let the rest of the team introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the podcast here. Matt, let's begin with you.
Sure. Good to be back again. And I am the co-director of the Economic and Legal Warfare Focus Area with IWI, jointly with Tom, who was prior to this call just regular Tom, and now he's Dr. Tom.
Nice.
It's true. I'll pick up here. Tom Johansmeyer. I co-lead the Economic and Legal Warfare Group with Matt. And last week I completed my PhD, where I look at insurance as economic security in the cyber domain.
Okay, I'll go last. Hopefully not least. Tom, first things first. I'll send you my prescription requirements so you can start filling those as soon as possible. My name is Gianni Koskinas. I spent about 20 years or so in the military, special operations, mostly focused on counterterrorism. And after I left the military, I started working initially in the mining industry, and then later as a government contractor and national security analyst, as a senior fellow in a DC think tank, board member, board of directors member, and I keep on looking for more work to do. So here's another one of my hobbies. Actually, my favorite hobby is to talk on this podcast. So we can get started. Thanks, Hamlet.
Perfect. Good. Well, let's just jump right into this. We obviously have an agreement with Iran, a memorandum of understanding, or a path towards a deal. I think there's been a lot of confusion depending on political bias and filtering on whether this is a deal, it's a good deal, it's a bad deal, it's a disastrous deal. What I'd love to do is get each of your perspectives on what you think, or what the perspective of this agreement is, and how it is and is not something that's going to be anything that's going to be anchor or binding in terms of an agreement. And then from there, I'm sure we're gonna spider web in a bunch of different directions. So, Tom, let's begin with you on that.
First off, I guess to kick things off, I would say that if it's a deal, a framework of a deal, a preliminary step toward a deal, let's recognize what it is, which is a step. And whether it's a step toward what was pre-existing or a step towards something new, either way, it is a step past conflict. Hopefully we'll see further in that direction, but I think we have to balance expectation for an end state, let alone an end state relative to what was done by prior administrations, against simply where we are at present. Matt, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think this is interesting. There's a lot going on, and I think that we will definitely veer into the area of sort of cognitive operations at the moment, because I think there's so much consideration and perspective and bias that's gone into this. Tom, as you said, a deal is at least a step, and I think that that's important to recognize. I mean, if we're looking at things in a vacuum based on what was put out in the media, I think that there's certainly some concern as to the agreement. I think that to have an agreement is also something that is challenging when you're dealing with masterful negotiators such as the Iranians, who negotiate in a far different way than we negotiate. These are topics that we've discussed before, and I think that we'll touch on today. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. But as the lawyer on the call always says, there's the good and the bad. There's no clear answer. So I think by the end of the today's call, we'll circle back and see if our perspectives have changed.
Hamlet, would you like me to say something and then you
Yeah.
chime, because I know that you have some deep thoughts on this, and sometimes we've gone back and forth on. Look, I think that there are a lot of chess moves being played right here, and I think that there's a lot that went into the agreement of how to move forward. Now, this is a memorandum of understanding. It's not an agreement. It's not a deal. It's not even, something people think it's an outline towards a path towards something. But even in the way that people describe this thing, whatever it is, I think what we realize, or analysts should realize, is that people went into the creation of this MOU with different perspectives already. They started, even in the way it was sequenced, for some, maybe let's just say the US, for example, for some, these were conditional topics that would be addressed at a later stage, once we get to some proof of compliance with some of the previous ones. Others were setting them up as sort of the narratives that they can move forward to as soon as it's released, so they can go both to domestic and exterior audiences. The point is that every single word in this thing can be utilized by one party or the other to make it sound as if it's one thing or another. My concern with this is that the belligerents at play, whether you see it's the U.S. and Iran pact or path towards, it's the U.S. representing a group of countries and interests, but other countries have different interests, like Israel, for example, that perhaps diverge from one. And I think Iran actually is playing its cards in order to almost accentuate some of these differences, rather than kind of take a normative path that things will work out just fine. This is just a starting block. Now they're playing it, for a different parameter. So again, this turns into a memorandum of misunderstandings if you actually start without considering that people went into this with already existing agendas that they're trying to start from the moment that this thing hits transmit, or even before, because they were building narratives even before they had hit transmit.
No, I think you guys make some great points there. I mean, I view this as really nothing more than a much more of a formalized 60-day ceasefire that's allowing for both sides, actually probably I would say three sides, to figure out how to get to a constructive deal. And what I mean by three sides, I think, or potentially actually four sides, now that I think about it. On one side, you have the U.S. And the Israeli collective interests on what we want to see as a desirable outcome. You probably have what is probably the Israeli interests of what they really want to see as a result of this outcome. And then I think you have two different parties inside Iran. You have the absolute hardline regime fanatics who have full control of the levers of government and negotiations right now. And you have the hardline lights and the rest of the people that probably want some sort of pragmatic deal. How do you navigate that, or can you? So that's kind of my overarching perspective or issue here. I think what we're looking at right now is literally a 60-day path where, put it in terms of a transaction we're all familiar with. We just put a very, I guess, restrictive offer to buy a house that's got a lot of issues. And in the next 60 days, we're going through inspection. We're going through discovery, and there's going to be a lot that needs to be ironed out, because I think the two sides are so far apart in terms of what right looks like that I think it's going to be challenging to navigate this. And that's why I think over the next 60 days, while the kinetic conflict has stopped, and it'll stop for the foreseeable future, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, what is now going to be completely ramped up is the cognitive piece of this, and the economic piece of this. Who's winning? Who's getting the raw end of the deal? The Trump screw up, the mullahs and the regime corner themselves into the corner, that Israel overplay this hand. You're going to see factions with hidden vested interests of a desired outcome try to sway that And I think that's what we have to be guarded against, because if you turn on the news right now, depending on what channel and what country the news is emanating from, this is, hey, Trump and Israel have them exactly where they want them, or the Trump-Israel relationship is over and the Iranians have us cornered, or God knows what to make of this. So it really, perspective matters, and I think our adversaries are going to really work hand in fist to make sure they kind of tilt those balances. Kind of going down that vein, and Gianni, let's begin this with you. Matt, let's have you comment, and then Tom, let's have your perspective from a shipping standpoint. But what are the various different levers that we think the Iranians can now pull and influence? Gianni, I'd love your perspective on Lebanon and their little brother Hezbollah. Matt, would love your idea and your perspective on sanctions, which I think would dovetail, Tom, in terms of how you think them trying to asphyxiate the strait or use that as a threat or leverage point is going to play out over the next 60 days. So Gianni, let's begin with you there.
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue of axis of resistance is not playing out, is not getting enough airtime, I don't think. I think the way that Iran uses its, I don't even think that the right word is proxies, and I hear that all too often, but the way that it uses its, let's say, junior partners, the way that it uses its fellow resistance factions out there, which are part of the revolution. I mean, that is an exact issue that we need to address. Is at the heart of what's happening right now, particularly with Lebanon, and I think it's playing out in Iraq, and I think it's playing out in Yemen as well. For Lebanon first, I think Iran wants to, by putting Lebanon as the number one bullet point on the MOU, Iran was trying to, again, I'm not saying this is bad, good, and indifferent. This isn't a political statement. This isn't addressing anything to do with how the U.S. has handled one thing or another. I'm just trying to explain how the region is reading certain things, right? So Iran was looking at basically, or is looking in the region as a deal maker. They are now exercising their influence over a country in conflict that up until this MOU, we could say Iran played a big part in influencing, funding, using the ideology to support Hezbollah. But up until then, we were talking Israel ambassador talking to Lebanese ambassador in the U.S. with U.S. intermediaries. And at some point, Hezbollah was coming into this, and Israel and Hezbollah were going to talk at one point, because these are the belligerents there. Now Iran, by both the MOU and its ballistic missile strikes on on Israel after Israel struck Beirut, all of a sudden they're trying to play up that they are not just an issue with the Strait of Hormuz and an issue between, that stays within its borders, but it's actually impacting and is flexing its muscles on a regional scale. So Iran, the deal that they're trying to work out, where they're acting as a guarantor for peace in Lebanon, or issues in Lebanon, is really trying to block Israel and is trying to assist its axis of resistance partner, and it's playing out well. In Iraq, people are looking at this and saying, see, they fought the greatest Air Force and military on the planet, backed up by the most significant regional, and here's where they are. They're playing their cards extremely well, and therefore I'm going to keep on hitching my wagon to them. I'm going to keep on looking towards the east for influence. And even though the Iraqi prime minister is coming to U.S., and we could be talking about a lot of other things besides just the demobilization of the Popular Mobilization Forces or dearming of them. But instead, now we're talking again, and they have more juice to go through. So Iran is playing its cards with a long game. I know this is no surprise to anybody, but with playing the long game in terms of influence and where this thing goes. They're taking a point at a time. hoping to score much bigger points in the long run rather than just, score the 3-pointer at the end of the game and win it. Over.
Great point. Matt, welcome your perspective in terms of what this means in terms of interim and long-term sanctions relief.
Yeah, and I'll just to touch briefly on what was just discussed from the regional dynamics. I mean, and I'll shift this to sanctions in a moment. I think I was asked a question just the other day, which is, is Lebanon worth it? Right? Is everything that's going on and all the rhetoric that's happened now, potential breakdown negotiations, worth it? And I just think it's really interesting because you think about if you'd studied, in fact, the first targets that I ever looked at in the government, what happened to be in Lebanon. And if you look at the dynamics and the relationships and you look at the proxy network that Iran has built, Iran doesn't have what they have today without that proxy network, right? So is it worth it? And I think the short answer is, and like the less complicated answer is yes, it is worth it, right? You lose Lebanese Hezbollah, and you look at what has happened now from the PMF and some of the clerics that are in the Shia clerics in Iraq, you see statements being made about Iran, statements being made about the U.S. Do they trust the deal? They're still leaning in the Iranian direction, right? That makes sense. But you lose credibility as soon as you give up Lebanon, for example, right? Which is like the preeminent, as you said, like I forget the term you used, Hamlet, a moment ago, but like the sort of baby Iran, right? Like their most important proxy. So I think it is worth it. And I think that that's what's making this so complicated. And like I forget you said a moment ago, you negotiate a deal on behalf of a bunch of multiple parties, right? Gulf parties, Israel, so on. You can only control a sovereign nation so much. And I think, and maybe you don't want to, right? But if you want to, you can only control that party so much. So unless they're a signatory to the deal themselves. So I think that presents a very, very complicated dynamic here. Shifting to the question you asked, Hamlet, regarding the sanctions and what is occurring now. I mean, it's interesting, right? The first day after the MOU was signed, you saw, I think, gas prices up here in New York drop by like $1, which was amazing. So, I mean, there's a nice short-term sort of deflation at the pump here. But from a sanctions perspective, it's so interesting, so complicated, and there's so much that's going on that we don't know about. And quite frankly, even sanctions experts, I mean, there's so many codes out there and the SDN list. It gets very complicated. How much access does Iran really have to these funds now that we're talking about this $300 billion number? Is that really $300 billion? Does the country really have access to all that money, or are people, I mean, there are still these individuals, these organizations within the IRGC, within Iranian bank network that can't access that money. So is it really $300 billion? I don't know the answer to that. That takes a really deep analysis. But if we compare now to what we saw, I don't know what it was in 2000, maybe it was about a decade ago, right? With JCPOA, we started the Obama administration. I think the number was like $400 million on day one, peanuts compared to 300 billion, right? 1.7 or 1.6 billion shortly after, and then $100 billion with regards to frozen assets that were abroad. How much of that was actually transmitted to the Iranian government? I can't answer that. The Treasury Department estimated about 50 billion was actually paid. The rest paid off debts and interest abroad. Again, we get into this really like esoteric analysis of like how many dollars actually make it home. But the same goes now. I think it's a lot of money. And I think that we need to be careful as to how that money is released. I think as we said before, this is just an MOU to an agreement. So releasing money under an MOU it's questionable, right? If we have a formal agreement, it's a different story. We need to see how that plays out and then where those funds actually go. It becomes difficult to track once you release all that money. But Iran's playing a long game. And they're proven to be very good negotiators. And from a PR perspective, they're certainly doing a good job. And I think that they are sowing discord, not just here, but elsewhere around the world, saying, look at all this money we're getting and we're winning. Whether or not they get that money, we'll have to wait and see. But I think that it's not the best response, but because we have this sort of interim period between signing the MOU and signing a prospective agreement that hopefully comes to fruition, there's going to be a lot of unknowns. And I think that there's going to be a lot of questions. And that is why many financial institutions will probably still be hesitant to sort of transact business or do business because they don't know what will happen, right? Well, is this a change in law? Not really, right? The executive branch has the ability to adjust that sanctions list within the bounds of the law, but there is no change in law, right? No, certainly not yet. So I think time will tell, and I think that it is certainly being used as a lever in this cognitive war that is occurring, adjacent to the kinetic conflict and adjacent to the negotiations that are occurring.
Right. Great point. Tom, coming over to you, let's talk about the importance of the Strait shipping and attacking insurance market as Iran's ability to try to assert leverage, not only during the 6-day period, but what's their capability going to look like beyond that?
What's interesting is they've gotten basically a proof of concept over what so many countries had thought about, worried about, strategized over, and planned for decades, right? They've now seen what interfering with traffic in the Strait looks like. They see that it can be successful. They see that it does have some amount of asymmetric benefit, whether it completely compensates for difference in capability or other kind of gap in strength and leverage. I mean, it gets to be a bit more uncertain at that point. But for where we are now, they just found out that they have something useful. And that something is not just useful in pushing back against the United States, but also in driving further divisions in an already somewhat divided NATO environment. So basically, they can make life hard for the U.S. They can make life hard for the U.S. and its allies, as well as the U.S. relative to its allies. And they can have global impact without limitation to the United States or partner and ally states, which means they can foment sentiment against their who they believe are their aggressors. The Strait's useful. And, me sitting back, I think, well, I hope this never happens in Turkey. That's my immediate thought, because Bosporus and Dardanelles are also heavily trafficked and very important, maybe not as much as Hormuz. It does make me think about Bab al-Mandab and Suez. They've actually shown the world that straits in potentially volatile environments can have significant effect. So even if everything proceeds from MOU to agreement to execution and maintenance of that agreement over the long term, we now have to think about, from today, the impact of geopolitical volatility on transportation choke points, regardless of where they are. As an executive in the commercial space, I now need to think about my supply chain costs, and alternatives. Right, I need to think about how goods will get to me if something goes wrong in any number of places on the globe, strictly because of Iran and Hormuz. Plain and simple. And you mentioned insurance. As an insurer, I now need to think about how I extend cover for shipping and supply chain, and other kind of aggregating factors as a result of these choke points as well. Basically, life got a little bit harder for everybody. Strategy and planning becomes a lot more important on a direct cost and profitability basis. So the commercial world's just changed, which means the political world isn't going to be far behind.
Hey, if I can jump in, Tom, just for Hamlet's, to give Hamlet an opportunity on this one, because I think, Hamlet, we've talked in previous conversations on this podcast about kind of a long-term impact versus near-term impact for Strait of Hormuz, and to that end, how the region is even reacting with respect to the Saudi Arabia building more pipelines, UAE building more pipelines, alternatives to the Strait. How do you see, as a longtime student of this and practitioner, how do you see all this playing out with the Strait in the near, mid, and long term?
I think Tom made some great points here. I think the accidental success, I hate to use this word for the regime here, is their military has been devastated. Their nuclear enrichment infrastructure has arguably been severely degraded. But what they stumbled upon is, we don't need a military, and maybe we don't even need a nuclear weapon anymore to hold the world hostage. All we need to do now is just saber rattle and throw a bunch of mines and launch a bunch of small craft into the Mediterranean, and that shuts down global shipping. And if we can do that in conjunction by getting our Houthi brethren to do the same thing in the Red Sea, we can make a lot of noise. And if you look at this, there are some parallels between North Korea and Iran. North Korea, it's to the point is once they had a nuclear weapon, no matter when or how they threw a temper tantrum, you have to listen to them because they have a nuclear device. Outside of that, they don't have any impact on a geopolitical scale. I would argue Iran, even without a nuclear weapon now, the regime has stumbled upon what I think is a very useful lever to throw a temper tantrum whenever you want to affect your impact or your thoughts on the geopolitical scale. Tie that into them trying to keep Hezbollah alive, literally in Lebanon, I think speaks volumes to this. I view the Lebanon piece as a piece of desperation in certain aspect from the Iranians. Between October 7th and the series of events that kicked off, where Israel methodically has been culling Hezbollah capabilities from a leadership, physical, and kinetic standpoint throughout southern Lebanon, has been intense. And for the first time ever, you're starting to see Lebanon trying to say, hey, no, you know what, we're our own country. We are not Hezbollah. I think that, to me, panics Iran to a certain point. And then I think, Gianni, you posted this week about the covert influence that Iran is trying to expand in Iraq within the Shia community, not only to solidify Iraq as a proxy state of theirs, but now eventually serve as a launching point for attacks against their Arab countries. So I could see a scenario where whatever is agreed upon 6 weeks from now or eight weeks from now doesn't hold, and Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon to hold as hostage or use to hold the global economy as hostage. But what they do now have is access to funds and proxy networks that can now attack the global economy and use that as a leverage point. And that impacts everything. It impacts sanctions, it impacts regional stability, and Tom, to your point, it obviously directly impacts global shipping. So would love you all's comments and kind of riff on that.
Yeah, so what's interesting in Hamlet is your comparison to North Korea and their nuclear weapon. The one principal difference between North Korea having a nuclear weapon and Iran having the Strait of Hormuz, I would say, is usability. When you having a nuclear weapon and saber rattling is great, but you're still going to go through a certain amount of deliberation before you even speak about using one, let alone actually executing. But what Iran has seen is that they can use economic weapons without the same sort of taboo, without the same long-term permanent impact, which means if they want to send gas prices up, they can, and we can suffer. And they can use this regularly. They can use it sporadically. Even if gas prices go up and down, they're creating volatility instead of long-term pain. And the best part about economic weapons is their impermanence. So you can deploy economic weapons as coercion or as a negotiating tactic. But at the end of the day, you can still revert somewhat back to normal, where that's not possible with a nuclear weapon. So it's almost as though they have a leverage point with a lot more range. Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is I think that's a really good point. And this economic lever is almost more of like a conventional type of weapon, right? And we don't think about that in terms when we think conventional weapons. We think like a bomb, or we think a non-nuclear bomb. We think of infantry, but this is really a conventional weapon. I mean, logistics has been around forever. I think I was reading something the other day, like the history behind like the French military like 300 years ago, and how logistics came to be like a military doctrine. And I think that it's been overlooked for quite a few decades, right? And we look at the military industrial complex back during World War II, and then sort of a lapse in a way. And then we think about the effects on supply chain, how integrated the world is, and globalization, whether it goes up or down depending on politics, right? It's there, and it exists. It's all around us, and being able to pull that lever is really valuable, right? And there's also that, as you said, right? Pull the lever, use it to your advantage. Doesn't have the same taboo. And also Iran doesn't have the same parent, if you will, that North Korea has, which is China. So they're parentless. They have their relationships, they have their adversaries, but they act very much independent of like these conventional norms. And I think that being able to have an impact on the global economy really scares everybody, right? A lot. It scares everybody a lot, especially many of the countries that we're allied with that are not used to conflict or don't want to be involved in conflict. And being able to pull these levers right now, as I forget, maybe how many you said this, you don't need to have a military. You need to have this tying it back to the irregular warfare, right? You need to have this asymmetric capability. And I think what the statistic I read most recently was that Iran can produce 10,000 Shahed drones a month, right? That is able to harass the entire strait, right? Even more so, and countries around Iran. So when you're doing that, you're not really causing that much significant, like catastrophic damage, right? But it's enough to stop trade. It's enough to bring oil prices up. It's enough to scare everybody. And and tying this back to the original question, this MOU now, however many days we have until an agreement is maybe hopefully signed, that could be 20,000 drones. Again, that could just restart and reignite a whole conflict without having to have a navy, which Iran basically lacks at the moment, right? Have a couple of small dinghies, a couple of Shahed drones. You're harassing that strait. Nothing's going to get in or out because people don't want to. And Tom, no matter how much you're willing to pay for insurance, ships still don't want to get blown up, right? We've talked about that. So
exactly.
You can pay the amount of all the goods. Ships don't want to get destroyed, so they're just going to sit there. And then tying the final point I'll make before I turn it over to you guys is that I read some articles in I think it was the Financial Times, not like last week. Ships now, particularly European ships, are being much more receptive to saying, you know what, if I pay $1 million, that pales in comparison to how many goods that I have and the stop in trade. And that is exactly what Iran wants. And we are giving them that time frame to sort of rebuild that capability and capacity. So I think that those are some of these second, third order effects that we need to consider when we're thinking about not only stopping the conflict, but also reigniting global trade and allowing everybody to keep inflation low, to have access to energy, but also have access to supply chain, access to goods.
No. Great point. Gianni?
Yeah, I mean, the military guy in me just wants to, scream out that, there's two ways that you can look at this. You can either plan backwards from whatever objective you want to achieve and start setting milestones to do certain things, or you can have what's called movement to contact, which is basically, hey, I'm just going to keep on moving out, and then whatever I meet, I'm going to deal with it as you go along. Two different approaches, but again, there's a lot to be said about the near term of one and the longer term of the other. Look, there's a big difference between operational art and operational kind of employment of force, which is what we've done in the military in the Gulf and against Iran. There's a lot to be said about strategy, which most often is considered in the context of military strategy. And then there's something to be said about grand strategy, which takes economic, informational, and all the other things. So there's a lot of things out here that we need to take stock of, like, what do we want the region to look like? Not what do we want it to look like 2 weeks from now, 60 days from now, 2 years from now, but what do we want to look for it? And we can't plan on these silver bullet fixes. Like the Abraham Accords, great, but the Abraham Accords aren't going to fix everything. Okay. Is it a good start in some ways? Yeah. Has it altered certain dynamics amongst different Gulf countries and Israel? Fantastic. But has it fixed everything? Did it miss a couple of points that perhaps were, sources of frustration for some of the belligerents again? And you make deals without all the belligerents at play. So there's a lot to be said about the strategy and grand strategy of this. And I'd love to get into the conversation of it, but we're going to go a little bit too far with this. Where I actually want to go to, quite frankly, is that when it comes to each one of these countries, we're going to have to address certain things in longer terms for each one of those problem sets. And I'll give you one example, which we can talk about any of them. In Iraq, right now, we have a government and a prime minister that they've only approved 14 ministries. They're still dealing with the most significant and important ones, but they formed a government. But it was a consensus government that was built basically with a majority of pro-Iranian parties. Okay. And the way that they achieved that win in parliament was 5 years in the making. So if we're going to try to fix something or relate to an issue in Iraq, we have to think about, okay, let's think about the next parliament 5 years from now. Let's think about how do we set the conditions to where we can actually make incremental changes to where we're favorable. How can we take some of these pro-resistance factions off the table by dividing them from their more virulent, more, aggressive cousins? Okay. In some ways, that's what's Iran doing right now. They're looking to divide and conquer amongst alliances, different players. Europe may have a different pain threshold than the US or Israel, and US and Israel may have different. They're dividing us. They're looking to divide us. So why can't we look? I'm not saying we should look at their tactics, but in terms of their strategy, they're thinking about how do I make changes, incremental as they may be, but they may have bigger impact in the long run. So that's how I'd look at it.
No, I think that what you said, though, I think is, I hate to say it, one of the challenges for U.S. foreign policy, because you're talking about making massive, complex changes in a very fluid, dynamic environment that you need to have deep understanding and roots of the culture and society of that world that could take 5-10 years to fall into place. Well, your average intelligence officer, your average military officer, your average diplomatic officer is not at post for more than a couple of years. So you have no continuity there. Both left and right and center of media have been all clamoring about price of gas for the summer driving months, and they wanted peace before the World Cup started and the next election season. So as a country, we're fixated on these short-term little hurdles where our adversaries are focused. You can apply this to China as well. They're focused on 10, 15-year incremental gains to corner us. And we're so distracted by these little short-term, senseless little dates that we don't focus on the long term. So that, to me, I think is an inherent issue. I think the point that was brought up here on the back end of this call is probably one of the better ones I've heard in a while, which is this ability for Iran and the regime specifically to use economic warfare and economic piracy as a massive leverage point, not only during the MOU phase, but God forbid if there's a nuclear deal after this and anything doesn't go their way, they've now kind of stumbled upon a playbook of how to pull that lever multiple times at a very low cost and be able to force their will. And that's if this agreement doesn't address that, then I think we got some big issues.
Hamlet,
yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Before we go through like a little bit of a wrap up, I have a question for you, which is something that I've been thinking about, and I have some of my own thoughts here. But now we saw back in the beginning of the year all of the civil unrest that was occurring in the protests in Iran, and now Iran almost has effectively like a second front, right? Which is the situation occurring between the U.S. and Israel. There's because of everything that has happened, obviously, we have not seen much reporting about the civil unrest. But is the regime concerned about having this almost in a way like a two-front war, domestic and abroad, or do they not have a concern? And in some ways, do they see some of this relief as benefiting the people, not because maybe the regime has sympathy for the people, but because it will quell some of the discontent? Or do they view now what has occurred in a way of the people being more on their side? I mean, I'm curious your perspective on how the domestic population is thinking about this, because I think that has an impact as well.
Yeah, that's a $1 million question. I think they're confident that frankly the harsh beating they put on the people during the 3-day window when the internet was shut off did its job of putting those people in place, at least for the foreseeable future. And I hate to say it right now, it looks like it's working to a certain extent. What's even more disgusting, though, is the cognitive piece of this. By even the most conservative estimates, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40,000 people were killed during that window. The regime and through a couple of think tanks put out the 5,000 number as who was killed, and people who are anti-Israel, anti-Trump, anti-war have been just running with that number. 5,000 is still too many. Between 9/11 and October 7th,
I was going to say,
Israel
even
US
that's a big
lost
number.
less than 5,000
Right.
people.
Yeah.
So 5,000 innocent people getting killed for voicing their freedom is too many.
Should
So
be unacceptable.
right now, I think they feel confident. They feel confident where they have the foot on the throat of the people. And I think the people will be more than happy to rise up against the regime, but they got their ass beat, put it bluntly. So until they know something is coming to save them, or until there's some sort of an element within the regime that rises up against the hierarchy, I think the internal population right now is somewhat handcuffed. And what I'm afraid is if we go too far in terms of appeasing Iran, we've now lost an entire generation of vibrant, Western-leaning pro-youth that want change, but almost feel like they're abandoned. So,
Yeah.
that's something we can get into in a later call. But I want to wrap up here since I think we're hitting the 45-minute mark. And I want to ask you all to do a couple things. Look in your crystal ball and prognosticate how things are going to pan out over the next 6 weeks, 7 weeks. And I want to hear three things. One, how far is Team USA going to go? Two, who's going to win the World Cup? And then three, at the end of August, which is beyond the 60-day window, are we back in kinetic operations? And want to kind of hear your perspective on that. And Tom, let's begin with you.
Well, as much as I hate to admit it, I think Team USA has a better chance of winning the World Cup than we do of seeing a smooth progression over the next 6 weeks. I mean, these things move in fits and starts. Negotiations are not linear and predictable ever, let alone with parties that have the history that these two or four or more do, depending on how you look at the population. I am an optimist, so I think we'll come out of this 6 weeks being further along than we were before. I think we might make some real progress toward pre-existing thresholds. But in terms of breaking new ground, even past 6 weeks, I'm a bit skeptical. That being said, I have game planned and imagined my way to Team USA at the Meadowlands in the middle of July. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Matt, why don't you take it next?
Yeah, I was just getting PTSD from taking the trip over to the Meadowlands from New York. It sounds like a 6-hour commute that I want to make. I like your probability that you prescribed earlier about who's going to win the World Cup versus concluding this agreement. Obviously, I want the U.S. to win the World Cup. As far as maybe who's preferred, and maybe France is looking good right now, but I think it would be really great if the U.S. played Iran, right? Because there's still a possibility. There's a possibility that would happen. There is a chance that could happen, which would be incredible. So I don't think that there's. I hate giving binary answers here, like yes or no's. I don't think there's a chance that an agreement signed within that 60-day time period. I just can't see it happening. If I look at every agreement that let's put Iran out of it for a second, just talk about the U.S. Any agreement that we've negotiated over the past decade takes much longer than what we say it's going to be. So I don't think that it's going to be 60 days. I think something will be signed at some point. I don't think it's going to be 6 months either. It'll be somewhere in between. But I think there's going to be issues along the way. There's going to be big speed bumps along the way. Whether that is kinetic issues in Lebanon, whether that is additional strikes on Iran because of mining activity or drone activity. I think that there's going to be a lot that is going to happen over the next 60 days. The one thing I will say is, and I'm saying this as like a very biased person living here in the US, the optics out of the MOU are not amazing, right? And I think that it would be great if we snuck a couple more wins in there. And I think that it's really important that we focus on issues like proxies, how financial resources are dispersed over a time horizon where certain objectives have to be met in order to do so. I think that Iran has a lot to lose and they're playing a longer game. And I think that it would be great if we were able to show that, like, at the end of the day, we do have the upper hand and we need to apply that pressure. We need to apply that leverage. A lot of it's on paper. And as us who are in the government know, which I think is everybody on this call at some point, labels matter, optics matter. And I think that that's a really important piece of this. So we will get somewhere. It will take some time. and there will be bumps along the way. But I do think that we'll see some resolutions. I think we're going to open up embassies in Tehran in the next year. That's a stretch, but I think that we're going to have some sort of agreement in place over the next few months.
Oh my God. Embassy in Iran. I like to remind everybody that we had this little thing that happened during the Iranian Revolution when we had some hostages, and
I was there.
It took an election and a change in U.S. president in order for that thing to work. So I think that you killed my daddy kind of construct is going to play out for a while. And I don't see, look, as an American wanting Team USA to win in every possible everything, I would say I sincerely hope it happens. But as an analyst, looking at data and looking at what has happened historically, it's possible that we're going to have something completely different happen, but it's unlikely that we're going to see, father killed, mother killed, wife killed, sibling, others killed, and all those things have happened. And somehow, let's just turn the page, extend a new hand. It's not the way Iran plays.
Yep.
And also to Tom's earlier great point about the use of economic tools. The Strait of Hormuz previously was thought as a last resort in case we attacked Iran proper with change the regime. So the regime felt threatened. They triggered, Strait of Hormuz thing, and they saw the weapon that was used. And I think, Hamlet, we've used this before, the weapon of mass destruction for the nuke versus the weapon of mass disruption for the Strait of Hormuz. We used that in the previous call. So, it's not necessarily an issue that we haven't addressed in the past. But just to wrap things up, I think that whereas Iraq, for example, is worried about Iraq versus France today, I think that once the region is thinking in those terms, they're thinking that Iran tied, I think it was Belgium. They think in those terms, and that distraction is going to go away, and we're going to be right back at this.
Yep.
So I think we're in for the long haul. I think we need to pay attention to our alliances, because that's what's going to really help us out in the long game. Tend to what's happening to the Gulf states, tend to what's happening around the globe. We have to be able to say to everybody that we're a good teammate, and that we're going to stand by certain things, or otherwise we're going to start losing some credibility.
Yep. Great. Excellent feedback, and I'll leave you guys, I guess, with my 2 cents. I think Team USA makes it to the semifinals based on gut, grit, and patriotism. I think this is the year that the Dutch finally don't choke and win their first World Cup. So that's kind of where I'm at. I do think there's no chance that the MOU leads to any kind of a workable deal. I think we're back in kinetic conflicts by the time we get into September. Orange power, exactly. I think we're kinetic is coming, but I think in the next 60 days, you're going to see a significant escalation in cognitive warfare and regular warfare. So this ties back into what I've been saying for the last 6 weeks, which is expect more escalation for de-escalation. I think the reason for that is, and as leave it as the Iranian in me to finish this call with a metaphor, but the Iranian Islamic Republic was built on this vision by these co-founders. One was Marxist and one was a kind of a Muslim Brotherhood parallel in Khomeini. And they built this vision of this glorious mansion that they wanted to build. And what they have now is a giant decrepit piece of failure that everyone wants out of, except for the founders and the original owners, which are the people who hold the paper on that, which is the regime. Everybody else who lives in that house wants to sell and wants out. The problem is I think we're negotiating with the people inside the house. We're negotiating with the people who have a vested interest of living there. What we're not negotiating with is with the people who actually built it and who own the papers and who have the legal and the physical authority to execute a deal, and those are the hardliners. call me just a diehard anti-regime guy, but as long as the hardline establishment owns the keys to the house and owns the deed, there is no deal, because the deal that they want is not palpable to U.S. It's not palpable to the West, and I think that's why the next 2-month period is going to lead to failure, and we're going to be right back in some sort of conflict with the regime. But Matt, I think you made the point excellent. In the next 60 days, the amount of cheap flying lawnmowers they can build through the help of China and Russia, and build up these cheap, inexpensive one-way drones, that can debilitate the straits for forever. And put a handful of those in the hands of the Houthis like they did over the last couple of years, and you have a significant issue in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf at that point. So I guess what that means is for pontificators like us, now that there's an MOU, doesn't mean the podcast series is over. I think there's going to be a need for us to continue to have these colorful conversations. So I want to thank you guys for your time. I want to thank you all for your input. For those of you who've been on these calls prior, welcome back. For those of you who are new to us, hope to see you again. And more importantly, thank you for your time and interest. And looking forward to talking to you all soon. And go Team USA.